Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for our next session of our Spotlight on GitHub Advanced Security series, Navigating the Wild Seas of Open Source License Compliance. My name is Anna. I'll be your producer for this session. I'm an event planner for Reactor, joining you from Redmond, Washington. Before we start, I do have some quick housekeeping. Please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We seek to provide a respectful environment for both our audience and presenters. While we absolutely encourage engagement in the chat, we ask that you please be mindful of your commentary, remain professional and on topic. Keep an eye on that chat. We'll be dropping helpful links and checking for questions for our presenter to answer. Our session is being recorded. It will be available to view on demand right here on the Reactor channel. With that, I'd love to turn it over to our speaker for today. Eric, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, Anna. Hi, everyone. I'm Eric Sorenson. I'm a product manager at GitHub working on supply chain security. And today, I'd like to talk with you about open source license compliance. License compliance is an area of recent interest for me, but I've been involved in open source more generally since the early 2000s. I was a systems administrator and SRE for a long time, including a horrendous Thanksgiving where the production service that I was on call for was down for something like 20 hours. My involvement with the early DevOps community led me to product management, and I worked at Puppet Labs for 8 years. I've been at GitHub since 2022. Initially, I worked in our open source program office, and now I work in security products focused on the dependency graph and open source supply chain tools. I also used to sail boats a lot, hence the theme of this talk. I spent a lot of time in the San Francisco Bay Area off the front of a 35-foot shock sailboat. And I should note, though, that while I used to be a sailor, I was definitely not an attorney. This talk touches on subjects that have legal ramifications, but nothing in here should be taken as legal advice or something that you should solely rely on. It's extremely important that you talk to a real attorney or your legal team in your organization before making any decisions about licensing, especially if they affect your organization or company. But with that out of the way, I do hope you'll come away from this talk with an understanding of the history and the current state of open source licenses. There are some pretty clear do's and don'ts about licensing that we can talk about, not in a legally binding sense, but just in the realm of common sense and good practice. And I hope to present some new information about tools and efforts that are working in this area to help you navigate the waters. The ultimate goal here is to help you avoid legal and technical trouble. I feel like there is a fog of FUD, of fear, uncertainty, and doubt around licensing, with a nugget of real, actual risk at the center of that fog. So let's dispel the fog and understand reality. With that said, let's hoist sail and get started. So my top level hot take about this area is that it's both very important to get right, as well as really complicated to do so, especially walking into it as a non-expert, as I was about this time last year when I started studying and working on license compliance as a product area. What makes it so complicated, though? Well, there's a lot of licenses. There's about 250 licenses with official designations from the System Package Data Exchange Project, SPDX project. And there's a couple of thousand distinct identified licenses beyond those officially designated ones. There's also no automatic enforcement mechanism in open source software like there is in commercial software. Ultimately, licenses are just text files in a repository, and there's not like a licensing prevention mechanism that would say lock you out of seats or expire your software if you don't comply with the terms of licenses. It's sort of on you, the end user, to make sense of them and to make sure that you're in compliance. So this combination of a legal problem domain, open source software ecosystem, and interestingly, some competing ideologies or motivations behind them have not exactly led to a tidy bundle of answers. There's also multiple interests at play here, and we'll talk about licensing in this talk through the eyes of 3 distinct roles. End users or individuals generally want to be good actors and community members. Success for them tends to look like complying with the terms of the software that we use and contribute to without fear of repercussions, without fear of getting into trouble. Maintainers want licensing terms that match your intent and help you achieve your goals for the things you've written. This may span anywhere from do whatever you want with it, all the way up to you must not use the software that I've written in ways that I personally don't agree with. And both of those positions, by the way, are enforceable through licenses. And organizations really trade off business risk against the benefits of using open source. I mean, they'll usually use their vast resources to support the poor open source maintainers whose labor powers their profit. I mean, I'm sorry, back to reality. I was off in fantasy land for a minute there. As a practical matter, they pretty much just want to mitigate the risk of employees who adopt open source and make sure that licenses are compatible with the risk profile that the company has. Why is it so important, though? What are the consequences of getting licensing wrong? Well, there's quite a few examples of license noncompliance causing trouble. Open source libraries can pull in incompatible licenses. There's a pretty famous episode with a library called MyMagic that was a core piece of Ruby on Rails, where the author of the MyMagic library had unknowingly added a GPL v2 dependency into his MIT license project. So to fix that, he relicensed his package to GPL v2, pulled all of the old non-compliant MIT versions from the package registry, and completely broke Rails installation for thousands of people around the world. It's a law of unintended consequences there. I also want to highlight an instance that's of interest because there's real money at stake. There's a brand of home electronics called Vizio. They make smart TVs that run Linux, but Vizio has refused to provide the source code and a way to run a modified version of it on the TVs. The Software Freedom Conservancy tried asking nicely, but ultimately sued when Vizio didn't release the software. And this has been going through the legal process since 2021. I followed the court filings and all of the proceedings in this case, and the actual court date is coming up later on this month. So that's 5 years of massive legal battle. And this is kind of a worst case scenario for a company that was just looking to get something for free by using Linux for their adware TVs or their open source operating system. And they could just release the installer and make the whole problem go away, but they haven't done that yet. All right. Well, but what is a license really? Where did they come from? Let's get into it a little bit more deeply. A license ultimately is just a piece of text that accompanies software that describes the conditions of use as determined by its author or owner. Well, because software is treated as intellectual property in the legal realm, it's therefore subject to copyright law, and licenses are legally binding. Let's take a deeper look at one of the original open source licenses to understand what it is that we're actually talking about here. We'll dive into the original 4-clause BSD license. This is from 1980. It's pretty straightforward. Don't worry about the monospace font. It's pretty easy to follow along here. There's a copyright statement where you fill in your own name and the year you're in. A header that says that the redistribution is permitted provided you meet the following conditions. You need to retain the copyright notice and the list of conditions that follows. This is an all caps disclaimer that includes that's includable in the license. The second clause says basically the same thing as the first, but it's about binary form. Since there's not text code, you have to include the text alongside of the binary in some way. There's this advertising clause. This clause got removed in 1999 because it was sort of weird and unworkable, but it said that advertising has to include the fact that this product includes software that was developed by University of California, Berkeley. And the last one is sort of the inverse of the advertising clause, saying that despite the fact that you're using the Berkeley originated code, that doesn't imply an endorsement of whatever it is that you're using. Also got removed before too long. So that's pretty much it. It's a pretty simple set of terms, and more or less allows a permissive use of the software that's licensed under BSD to do more or less whatever you want with it. But of course, things got more complicated over time, and we can't talk about open source licensing really without discussing the elephant, or I mean, the ruminant in the room, aka the GNU public license. As a quick refresher, GNU cheekily stands for GNU's Not Unix, which is a recursive acronym that I bet was hilarious in 1983 when Richard Stallman came up with it. The motivating principle behind GNU was that software should be free in the sense of freedom, in addition to being free in the sense of not costing money. And the distinction between free and non-free software for Stallman was whether you had the right to, I'm quoting from his manifesto here. As I said, ideology comes into play in licensing in a way that you might not have expected. But from the GNU manifesto, it says you need to be able to run a program for any purpose, study the mechanics of the program, modify the program, and redistribute copies of the program. And the means by which these freedoms are guaranteed is the software license. The GNU public license, or GPL, uses a bit of rhetorical jujitsu called copyleft. Probably also a hilarious pun when it came with it as a play on words of copyright. It uses the protections of the intellectual property copyright system to say that you can't take a GPL license library, make modifications, and distribute your version under your own license that requires people to pay you. Well, fast forward to today, and as I mentioned, there's now a massive proliferation of licenses. The ScanCode project has a giant list of them. The README and their GitHub project says that it is likely the largest collection of software licenses available on Earth and maybe beyond. So pretty bold statement there, but I imagine that it is probably unprovably true, or it's impossible to disprove that it's true, rather. So there are over 2,300 total licenses, but many of these that show up are not official designations. They're just snippets of license text that have appeared out in the wild, out in the open source world. That's the numbers on the end of each row, this SPDX licenses plus the license refs, as they're called. The smaller numbers in the middle center column are the licenses that have official SPDX designations, as I mentioned at the beginning. License refs are things like, just to grab one example completely at random, the anti-996 license, which forbids the use of the software by companies who engage in exploitative labor practices. This falls into this free restricted category in the center of the table. The row names here are the taxonomy from ScanCode, but the headers are my grouping that sort of tried to categorize them according to how easy or difficult it would be to use a package with this license in a corporate or enterprise setting. My takeaway here is that there's a lot of these licenses, but most of them fall into that permissive category. And these are things like that BSD license I just talked through, or the MIT license. And zooming out just a bit from the numbers, I feel like there's been some very interesting developments in the seascape or the landscape in the world of licensing. The GPL v3 and Affero public license came out in 2007, and as a response to violations of those 4 freedoms from the GNU manifesto. In Affero's case, they were concerned about SaaS providers who weren't obligated to release their modified GPL source code because it wasn't technically distributed. So the AGPL says that you need to have a download source option available if you make a network service that uses that code. Similarly, the GPL v3 added language that requires consumer devices or consumer products as it defines them that incorporate GPL v3. They need to provide a means to run a modified version of that software on the device. It's a powerful phrase, but it's meant that for some companies, notably Apple, that's a hard pass. They're not going to add a means to install a modified version of the iOS kernel on their iPhone, for example. There's also been a trend of open source companies who have a company as their primary sponsor or author. This is kind of the classic open core business model that use relicensing as a means to get more revenue in the door. My friend Adam Jacob refers to this as changing the denominator. That is, your business model looks like the number of customers you've got over the amount each is willing to pay. If that denominator is 0, it really doesn't matter how big the numerator is. The most prominent example of this recently has been Terraform, which in 2023 relicensed from the permissive Mozilla public license to the business usage source license, or BUSL, which requires a paid commercial relationship with the company if the software is used for commercial purposes. There's a whole talk's worth of topic on its own here, so I'm not going to get it too deeply. But I do think it's a very interesting example of using licensed text and the terms of and conditions of open source software as a business strategy. So with all of that backstory as the wind in our sails, the question becomes, where will it take us and what should we do about it? Let's think back to those three roles that I mentioned in relation to an open source ecosystem: users, maintainers, and organizations, and talk about some do's and don'ts for each. So for end users and contributors, I think the most important thing is to make sure that the software you're using has clear licensing terms and that you're using it responsibly. Mainly, this means that your derivative work should follow the original license for copyleft tools. And if you do end up distributing or packaging your own software, include those upstream licenses in your package. Most of these are pretty clearly laid out. The requirements are pretty clearly laid out in the license text itself. But as an end user, it's important to know which licenses you are beholden to and to make sure that you're fulfilling the terms of their terms and conditions that they set out for you. And don't cut and paste someone else's code into your project without attribution into your repository. I think that's the main takeaway for something not to do. Just really don't do it. From a maintainer standpoint, if we're creating a new package, it's important to make a decision about what license is right for your project, and then to make sure that it's expressed unambiguously and consistently. So that means on the GitHub repo, in your source code repository, and on your package registry, all of those should reflect the same license data. You can run the ScanCode toolkit, which is part of that project that I just mentioned that enumerates all licenses. It'll pull through a source repository and enumerate all of the licenses or license-like text that it found. So you can see if, for example, there's stray documentation strings that might get interpreted as a license, or if you've vendored upstream code into your own repo, whether that has an incompatible license. So you can run that yourself and make sure that there's see if there's any unexpected license breadcrumbs in there. So for enterprises, this is maybe where things get really interesting. So I have a couple of slides here. I think the first thing is to work with your legal team to codify a license policy. Everything starts with the policy. This is also a great time to set up or coordinate an open source with your open source program office. I've talked to a lot of folks in their company's open source program office, or OSPO. They sort of act as a translation layer between their legal team and the technical implementation to make sure the overall goals of the legal side, the risk management that they're trying to achieve, are expressed correctly in the technical realm in terms of which licenses specifically are allowed and which aren't. I'm a big fan of OSPOs. As I mentioned, I worked in GitHub's OSPO for 2 years, and it's a great community and an awesome way to set up a center of open source excellence for your organization. Licensing, contributions, consumption, all of those are sort of bundle up into the realm of an OSPO. Next, once you have that policy set up, you can implement preventive controls that will watch incoming PRs or incoming changes for adding upstream dependencies that violate the policy. Once that's set up, you can add detective controls that will scan an existing code base and find maybe pre-existing problems. I've chatted with a lot of folks who have mergers and acquisitions inside of their organization. And so a lot of times they'll receive a large code base from another organization and really have no idea what's in there. So scanning across that code and finding out which licenses are in there and whether there might be any landmines that they need to be careful of is a good way to mitigate the risk of onboarding a new code base. Once you've got that, you can sort of find and fix hotspots and prioritize where to work on based on the severity or pervasiveness of those of any non-compliant licenses. So, for example, there might be a single library that has a commercial license in it, for example, where the commercial relationship that you had has expired, and that would be definitely something to prioritize, even though there might only be one piece of the code that makes use of it. Conversely, there might be something that makes use of the GPL v3, for example, to call back to an earlier point, and uses that broadly across the code base. It's not in itself a inherent problem, but you might need to address it if you're distributing the software, for example, and are not making the source code available. Along those lines, make sure that you're complying with the terms of the licenses that you do use. For example, even permissive licenses like the MIT license have conditions that say that if you're distributing software that makes use of it, you have to include the MIT license along with your own software. So there are some obligations, even if the usage of of software that's licensed under MIT is pretty permissive. And if you want to get serious, there's an open standard that's developed by the Open Chain Foundation that describes the characteristics of a mature compliance program. All of these previous steps are incorporated in this standard. And in fact, the steps that I just walked through are derived from the recommendations from this ISO IEC 5230 standard. All right. Sorry, that was a lot. Hopefully you're still with me out there. Let's talk, now that we're safely back ashore, about how are we going to do that after consulting with your legal team, of course. Let's talk about some tools and technology that can help. So as we talked about earlier, this area is pretty complex, but you don't have to go it alone. There are open standards and cross-vendor organizations that are working to tame the complexity. The first one I want to talk about is reuse.software. This is a project that was started by the Free Software Foundation Europe that defines a TOML, T-O-M-L file that clearly expresses what licenses cover different parts of a code base and specifies a way to add headers directly into the source code to show where which license applies to each piece of the source code. This reuse compliant headers are really helpful. They help tools like ScanCode prioritize how to determine what license a software package is using, and it's very unambiguous. It allows you also to express complex situations, like, for example, if you have the main code base licensed under the MIT license, but the documentation part of the code base uses Creative Commons, that can be defined very easily in this reuse.software file, and again, reduces the ambiguity about how the package overall ought to be licensed. The next one is SALSA, or SLSA. This stands for Supply Chain Levels for Software Artifacts. SALSA is primarily concerned with supply chain security through generating, improving supply chain security through attesting, that is, cryptographically asserting provenance, what the state of the build system was, the fact that an artifact or a package came out of an attested build system. But it has a type of attestation called verification summary attestation that's available that asserts that the package was compliant with a policy at the time it was built. And so this is a way to attach an attested SBOM into the artifact and say that, for example, there was no violations of the company's license policy at the time that the package was built. I'm from GitHub, and so I'll talk a little bit about what's available inside of GitHub and where license data shows up for GitHub users. So all of the SBOM exports that are available from any repository's dependency graph page or the API endpoint contain direct and transitive dependencies for that repository, along with the license information for each one. So you can download an SBOM from any open source project, and it will contain the license data that our internal systems have determined is correct for each of the dependent packages that are included inside of that repository. Similarly, the dependency review action, which is available for free for all open source repos, it uses the compare API endpoint on the REST API to get a diff between two branches of a repository based on the dependencies information that's included in there. So You can see a diff if a pull request adds a change to your requirements.txt or a package lock. The compare endpoint and dependency review action can pull down what license information was contained inside of the packages which were added inside of that PR, and from dependency review action standpoint, block the PR if there are dependencies which are added which violate a list of allowed or denied licenses. That SALSA attestation that I just mentioned a moment ago are available for everyone. You can add an attest-SBOM action or an attestation action into your build workflow that will create a signature and store it in GitHub's SigStore instance and make that signature available for verification by anybody that uses it. And if you go to a dependency graph page, you can look through manually. You can peruse the dependencies that are available for any repository, and you can filter this down based on which licenses are in use by the various dependencies. So you can use this for your own repos or for upstream projects that you might incorporate or take a dependency on. And this is the part of the talk where I get to show off the product that we've been working on for the last 6 months. This license compliance for GitHub Advanced Security is coming up. I'm very excited to get it out into a limited public preview next week. And it builds on our experience implementing the controls I just talked about for GitHub's own processes. That is the tools that we use to build and ship GitHub Enterprise Server, GitHub.com. The team has taken a lot of the knowledge that we gained from working on those controls and parlayed them into making customer-facing features that will enable you to go in, build up a policy using those ScanCode categories of SPDX licenses, and add preventive controls that are in line with your pull requests. So new licenses that need to get an approval that will add an exception to your license policy if there's a new license that's added inside of that PR. Or you can make a package exception and say, I don't want to blanket allow this AGPL license, but it's okay to use in the context of this particular pull request. So we're really excited to get this out in the hands of customers. If you're a GitHub Code Security, GitHub Advanced Security customer, feel free to email me if you're interested in taking a deeper look at this. As I said, we'll be shipping it next week. So let's wrap all of this up. From takeaways, open source licensing can be complicated, but it's not something to be scared of. It is comprehensible to mere humans, and there's a lot of opportunity to reduce your risk and be compliant with the licenses that you make use of without necessarily undergoing getting a law degree or turning into somebody that talks incessantly about licenses, such as myself. The most important takeaway is to start with a policy and build outwards from there. Work with your legal team, talk to the folks who are involved with open source in your organization, and come up with a coherent policy that you can use as the basis for any of these additional layered on controls. And lastly, you're not alone. There is a rich ecosystem of tools and standards that are out there to help tame the complexity. And of course, we at GitHub are trying to help out in any way we can. Thanks so much for paying attention. Thanks for being here. Again, I'm Eric Sorenson, and that's the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining, and thanks again to our speakers. This session is part of a series. To register for future shows and watch past episodes on demand, you can follow the link on the screen or in the chat. We're always looking to improve our sessions and your experience. If you have any feedback for us, we would love to hear what you have to say. You can find that link on the screen or in the chat. And we'll see you at the next one.